Here's a reminder from Percival Scientific. Science hasn't stopped, and neither have we. Visit the Percival Scientific website to see our new 4-color and 7-color LEDs for plant growth.
Welcome to Plantopia. I'm your host, David Goddori, and I'm a plant pathologist at Cornell University. Any listeners who have never met a real live plant pathologist can be forgiven. We are a very low visibility, but very high impact profession. We protect the world's food supply from disease-causing fungi, bacteria, viruses, and nematodes, all of which want to eat your lunch. This time on Plantopia.
Apparently, they're colonizing plants that aren't aware they're there. They can just sit there and hunker in the bunker way below the level of visibility. And they're really, really good at hanging on.
Imagine, if you will, a superhero team whose powers include hanging out for long periods of time, doing nothing, and making an unsightly mess of where they live. No, they're not mutant middle schoolers. They're fungi.
Once we have a good foundation, which we're getting now, I think we can start to make real progress in sort of unshackling the management of this disease from obligatory fungicides every 10 to 14 days.
Today we're going to meet Sooty, Blotch, and Flyspeck, two fungi which, if not for their messy habits, would be so harmless that we would be exaggerating to call them pathogens. That's today on Plantopia.
Hi, my name is Mark Gleason, and I'm heading the task force that's producing the Plantopia podcast. I work at Iowa State University. I'm a professor, and I've been here 34 and a half years.
Plant pathologists don't have a lot of imagination sometimes when it comes to naming a disease. And today we're going to be talking about diseases that cause symptoms that look like sooty blotches and fly-like specks on a crop. Now, what do you suppose that a plant pathologist has named this?
Sooty, blotch, and flyspeck.
Why would they do that? What are the chances of
say that?
Yes. What are the chances of that happening again?
Well, I think it's very evocative, David, because the visible parts of these fungi are sooty blotches and specks that look like something a fly did.
I think anyone who's ever encountered this has probably most likely encountered it on an apple. That's where I've seen the disease most, but it does have a fairly broad range of surfaces on which it will grow. But could you just describe for us what it looks like on an apple?
Okay, some of you who have maybe only bought apples at grocery stores may not have seen it, but if you have your own backyard apples, or if you've been to farmers markets, you may have seen this on apples. It's there's two basic looks. One is a sort of a cluster of tiny dots, and I'm talking really, just sort of like the tip of a pencil, really small dots. They're dark black, shiny black, but they're in groups, maybe dozens, even 100, and that can be like an inch or two across on an apple. That's one look, the sort of fly speck look. The other look of these fungi is what looks like a kind of a smudgy dark brown to black, again, anywhere from half an inch to an inch in size on the apple, just on the surface of the apple.
But the thing is, we don't normally see that in fruit that we're buying at a fruit stand, or certainly not in the supermarket. Why is that?
Well, that's because we're buying Disneyland fruit, David. We're buying fruit that has a very high level of cosmetic beauty. And there is a price to be paid for that beautiful fruit, and that is that fungicides oftentimes need to be applied to these fruit to keep the sooty blotch and flyspeck fungi under control and give you that surface beauty.
Now, there are certainly diseases that attack apples that cause more than cosmetic damage. But if I understand it, you're saying that sooty blotch and flyspeck fungi are not in that category. They're largely cosmetic.
Yes, they're entirely cosmetic, or, well, I'd say very, very largely cosmetic. So if you closed your eyes and somebody put two apples in front of you, one of them covered with sooty, blotch, and Flyspeck, and the other completely clean and beautiful, and somebody asked you to bite into them, let's say they're the same variety, you couldn't tell the difference in taste. The sooty, blotch, and Flyspeck apple would taste just like the cosmetically perfect apple. Those fungi, sooty, blotch, and Flyspeck fungi won't hurt you. They're not a health threat. They don't affect the taste of the apple. But they're something that you're not likely to pick out of the bin at your favorite supermarket.
It sounds almost like, from a producer and consumer perspective, that both parties are equally to blame in this situation. If we wanted to assign blame, consumers want an attractive fruit. If they given a choice between two equally priced apples, one that looks perfect and one that does not, they would be understandably choosing the perfect apple. The producer, they produce what the consumer wants. So how do we change that calculus to result in a better outcome?
I think we need more sustainable ways to control these fungi. As they say, they just live on the surface of the apple. We've been relying on fungicides for 100 years, and they do the job. These aren't difficult fungi to kill with fungicides, but I think we need to look down some other avenues, and these are very understudied fungi, David. We need to do some work on the biological control side to look at other organisms that live on the surface of apples that might antagonize or suppress or control these sooty, blotch fungi. I'm talking about benign organisms, that microbes that live on the surface of fruit that may well contest that surface with the sooty, blotch and suppress it. The other option, and this is would be really desirable, would be to get genes or breed genes into apples that enable the apple fruit to be resistant to sooty, blotch, and Flyspeck. We don't have that yet. That's a long-term goal, but it would certainly help solve the problem. These aren't the only diseases of apples, but they are important because during the summertime they demand a certain number of fungicide sprays under the current way things are done, and it's I'm not sure that the blame situation fits here. Consumers certainly want pretty apples. We're all consumers. We all buy apples, or most of us do, and so it's not. It seems logical that the apple orchardists would try to deliver what we want to buy. But I don't think it always has to be like this. This is, again, I would call them a backwater of plant pathology research, the sooty, blotch, and Flyspeck fungal group. And so we're really just starting to open up the study of this group. And once we have a good foundation, which we're getting now, I think we can start to make real progress in sort of unshackling the management of this disease from obligatory fungicides every 10 to 14 days.
In general, there are more good microbes than there are bad ones, but the bad ones get all the publicity. Why do you think this particular group is relatively understudied?
Well, that's a good question, and a lot of it has to do with the fact that they're hard to tell apart. People started studying these in the 1830s through a microscope and looking at them on fruit and wondering what they were. But it was really difficult for the people who study fungi, who are mycologists, to separate one from another. And if you can't separate the individuals or the characters from each other, it's like reading a book and you're having a hard time keeping the characters straight. Well, you're not very interested in that book. So it seems logical or not surprising that mycologists have sort of avoided, and plant pathologists have sort of avoided this group because of the difficulty of telling one species of sooty, blotch, and Flyspeck fungus from another. This is not just an academic concern, because if you don't know who they are, it's really hard to say, to study or figure out how they behave and how we might defeat them. First of all, you have to know your enemy, and that's been a real struggle for 175 years.
Right. If we were to classify mammals by their appearance, a black and white cat doesn't look remarkably different from a skunk. But but it can make a very different impact on you if you make that mistake.
I like the analogy. That's great. That's wonderful. There's they don't the Sooty, Blotch, and Flyspeck fungi are cryptic. That's a term that's used by mycologists. They're cryptic. It means that there are many kinds that look the same. You look at them on the apple, and there might be 20 or 30 kinds of Sooty, Blotch fungi that to the naked eye look the same, and it's going to be really hard to sort those out without some extra weapons on your side.
What exactly are they living on when they subsist on the surface of an apple, which is really just a kind of a waxy coating? There doesn't seem like there's much there for the poor fungus to eat.
Yeah, I mean, it's easy to feel sorry for Sooty, Blotch, and Flyspeck fungi. They seem like exiles, right? They're out there on the surface of the fruit, and they're bombarded by ultraviolet light every time the sun comes up and light shines on the apple. They have nowhere to hide. The waxy surface is like a bowling alley. I mean, water just runs off it, so it's almost like a desert most of the time, unless it's raining or there's dew on there. It's extremely dry environment, and also during most of the time that apple is on the tree, there's very little to eat. So out there on the peel, on the edge of the wax, you're starving. You're being bombarded by rays. You're drying up. It's an extreme environment, really extreme place to live.
So, if we were to be teleological about this and give them purpose, we would say they've really picked a poor neighborhood in which to live, and yet these fungi have been doing this for a very long time.
Yes, and not only on apples, they're living on the surface wax of hundreds of different kinds of plants, an enormous diversity of plant stems, leaves, fruit. We just encounter them in agriculture and in the grocery store through Sooty, Blotch, and Flyspeck, but they're very versatile, you might say, in terms of the host plants that they grow on. They do specialize in growing in plants, but it's a wide variety of plants.
Has this had any genetic consequence for them in choosing to live in this environment?
Yeah, and that story's been kind of uncovered in the last 5 or 6 years by some research that was done at Northwest A&F University in Yangling, China, and that's a collaboration that we've had with them for a number of years. And they did what's called it's called functional genomics. Basically, they looked at fungi that are a little bit similar genetically to Sooty, Blotch, but they have different niche. Maybe they actually penetrate into a plant, and they compared those to Sooty, Blotch fungi. And through a series of probability programs, they were able to show that Sooty, Blotch, and Flyspeck fungi didn't start out as Sooty, Blotch, and Flyspeck fungi. They evolved from ancestors that were fundamentally different. They were classical plant pathogens that penetrated into the plant tissue where it's nice and moist and there's lots to eat. But over evolutionary time, they began to occupy this surface niche where seemingly it's a very tough place to live in comparison. How did they do that kind of evolutionary change? Well, they got simpler. They gave up part of their genome. They became simpler organisms. They discarded things that they didn't need. If you are a Sooty, Blotch, and Flyspeck fungus, what do you really need out there? Well, you don't need any enzymes that enable you to penetrate through the plant or to counter the plant's defenses against you, the fungus. Your needs are rather simple out there on the surface. So all those genes that are responsible for all those attack and defense enzymes that plant penetrating fungi have were discarded, and so the genome got smaller and simpler. There was a couple things that were kept. One of those was that the ability to produce melanin is very much enhanced in Sooty, Blotch fungi. Melanin is the stuff that makes your skin darker when you get a suntan. It's a similar biochemical to what's in these Sooty, Blotch fungi. And they have a lot of it because it's really great for protecting against UV rays from the sun. They also have some enzymes that allow them to break down wax and break down the cutin, which is part of that surface wax area. And so they can kind of hunker down into the wax a little bit, a little harder to wash off. So it's kind of like a foxhole that they're hunkering down in on this hostile surface of the fruit. So they've changed fundamentally. They've gotten smaller. Oh, by the way, they gave up sex, which certainly simplifies your life a lot. And they just became these organisms that stopped fighting it out with the plant and just lived there on the surface, not having any biochemical contact with the plant, other than once the fruit become larger and they start to mature, the starches inside the apple turn to sugar. And those smaller molecules, the sugar molecules, begin to leak through the apple skin onto the surface. And all of a sudden, the grocery store is open for the sooty blotch fungi, which have been living on practically nothing on the surface for most of that fruit maturation period. But right at the end, when the sugars are developing, all of a sudden they have a lot to eat and they grow really quickly on the surface. So right there in September, if you have a fall maturing apple, right there in September and October can be a real bonanza for sooty blotch and flyspeck fungi because suddenly there's nutrients.
And I imagine this has caused a lot of confusion in trying to control the fungi, because if you're trying to suppress them when they appear as symptoms, you're missing the colonization phase, which may occur months earlier.
Yeah, that's a really hard one to understand, right? I mean, they can just sit there and hunker in the bunker way below the level of visibility. And they're really, really good at hanging on. They're just staying on the surface, tiny little colonies with their melanin, but so small you can barely see them. And they're just waiting for an advantageous environment. That usually means all of a sudden I'm getting sugars through the peel, and maybe I've got a little bit of rain and dew, and it's off to the races. And they have the capability to turn it on and grow for them relatively fast. But they're slow-growing, modest organisms most of the time.
Plantopia is brought to you by the American Phytopathological Society, or APS, to honor the United Nations celebration of 2020 as the International Year of Plant Health. Healthy plants can help us solve world hunger, stabilize the world's climate, protect our forests, and add beauty to our lives.
Conviron is the world leader in controlled environment systems for plant science research. Conviron's reach-in plant growth chambers, walk-in rooms, and Argus control systems provide precise, uniform, and repeatable control of temperature, light, humidity, CO2, and other environmental conditions. Applications include plant growth, entomology, tissue culture, germination, and other research where tight environmental controls are required. Learn more at conviron.com or contact us at info@conviron.com.
Now, back to the show. Is there a particular window of opportunity for these fungi to become established on an apple, and then that window is gone? Or do they colonize the apple repeatedly through the season, but at an inconspicuous level?
Yeah, more like choice B there, David. We've done some research in our lab that shows that these spores of these fungi are dropping out of the sky onto the apple almost throughout the apple maturation period, which it can be 3 or 4 months depending on the type of apple you're talking about. It depends on the species of sooty blotch and flyspeck. Some species will drop their load of spores earlier in that fruit maturation period. Others will drop them a little bit later. So there's some characteristics of sooty blotch fungi that reflect how and when they drop their spores. But there are some species that will drop their spores anytime, right up until harvest. They'll still be dropping spores. And they're just so small, of course, that you can't see them, and you have to wait for the visible colonies to develop. But they're very good at hunkering down. I call them stealth fungi, because they're there on the surface. You can't see them until close to the end of the season. And also, the apple tree and the apple fruit doesn't know they're there. That's a peculiarity of this group of pathogens. They're sitting on the surface. There's no chemical crosstalk, no attack and defense biochemically going on between the fungi and the host. That makes them really different, really interesting and unique as pathogens. They're apparently they're colonizing plants that aren't aware they're there.
So if the spores that initially establish sooty blotch and flyspeck on the fruit are coming from the atmosphere, presumably they're also getting into the atmosphere from some kind of reservoir host. They're on some other plant. Where is that plant? And can we get rid of this and break the disease cycle in that manner?
That would be a classic way to control diseases. The little bit of research that's been done on where these spores are coming from suggests that the sources are outside the orchard. At least that's true in United States orchards. There's all kinds of plants outside there. Raspberries would be an example. Blackberries. Some trees, leaves on some trees can be places where sooty blotch and flyspeck fungi will grow, and then they can produce spores. And of course, outside the orchard, nobody is spraying fungicide. So they're building up out there, and when you have a rainy period with some wind behind it, those spores can float into the orchard up to several hundred yards. And so you'll often see more sooty blotch next to, let's say, a woodland that adjoins an orchard than you will in the middle of the orchard, farther away from the woods.
Is the fungus benefited by dew formation and abundant relative humidity and water films on the surface of the fruit?
Yes, to all of the above. These fungi like rain. Remember, even though you think they're out there in the environment and they have lots of moisture, they're living on, a bowling alley. They're living on wax, and it's hydrophobic. There's not much water on there. So, yes to dew, yes to rain. Those definitely give some stimulus, and these little bitty hunker in the bunker fungi will start to put out tendrils and start to grow a little bit larger. Even though there's not a lot to eat there, they get a little encouragement from the presence of water, and they will splash from apple to apple. We've shown that in our research that you'll have certain of those spores will splash off one fruit and go to the one down below, and you'll get a kind of a fruit to fruit transmission kind of thing within the same tree that way.
So you would think from the appearance of the symptoms that these fungi would be much more conspicuous on a lighter colored apple, a green or a yellow skinned apple rather than a dark red one. But is there differences in resistance among popular apple varieties with respect to susceptibility to sooty blotch and flyspeck?
It's a really good question, and all the available information would suggest that there are not differences. We wish there were. Then we could use certain varieties of apple as sources of genetics that we could eventually breed back that characteristic into other varieties. You're right that yellow-skinned apples, certainly these dark fungi are more conspicuous on, but any apple can get it, and we just don't have that apple that's or even pear as sooty blotch will get on pear as well. The only pear that I've never seen sooty blotch on are the Bosc pears that have that sort of a roughened brown surface. Sooty blotch doesn't seem to like that kind of brown corky surface. I'm not sure that apple consumers would want brown rough looking apples, but that might be a starting point for breeders.
So if I were a backyard orchardist and I just wanted a few trees and I wanted to be relieved of the problem of sooty blotch and flyspeck, what should I do?
Close your eyes. I mean, this is not a hurtful thing, right? And you're not trying to store your fruit for 6 months. You're going to eat it within a month or two after you get it probably off the tree. If you're growing backyard apples, you have other things that are, maybe more worrisome. Codling moth would be a prominent example. Scab probably. I think you can learn to love sooty blotch and flyspeck. I have.
So, Mark, at the time I was in graduate school, many, many years ago, the diagnostic test for identifying unknowns, like sooty blotch or flyspeck, consisted of you gave the sample to your graduate student and they worked on it. But the tests are more sophisticated now. How do you tell one of these cryptic species from another?
I feel sorry for the graduate student that you would have assigned this to, David, or that maybe you were the graduate student that got this. This is something for a graduate student that you don't like very much and you want to punish, because the identification back when you or I were in graduate school was really challenging. And, good scientists beat their brains on Sooty, Blotch, and Flyspeck for years and finally, abandoned it. Or just went off to another organism because this is so unrelentingly difficult to identify.
What has changed?
Well, what has changed is that we now have sort of popped the top on understanding the genetic code of not just fungi, but of course other organisms. We can put our saliva into a test tube and find out that we have a long lost second cousin. And in the world of Sooty, Blotch, and Flyspeck, we can finally use that information, that sequence of nucleotides, essentially the genetic blueprint of the fungi, to tell them apart. It's really, really helpful. It's not the only cue that we use. We use their appearance and their function, their ecological niche as well. But that DNA sequence information was such an enormous advance that we could finally 15 years ago, we thought there were 3 or 4 Sooty, Blotch, and Flyspeck species, but now that we apply DNA routinely, sequencing, we know that there's over 100 different species, and these are these cryptic species that I was talking about that are difficult to tell apart by eye. But once you get into the blueprint, you realize, hey, they're distinctive. They're distinctive, and maybe not just distinctive in their sequence, but also in the way they function, which is what we really care about. If we can pick them apart and tell one from the other, we have a better chance of defeating them, and hopefully in some more efficient and more environmentally sustainable way.
So the methodology involved in just investigating the genetics of these fungi has really opened some really great insights into both their evolution, this pathway from being parasites to now becoming these kind of innocuous inhabitants on the surface, on the waxy surface of a fruit. At one time, one of the sort of tenets of fungal evolution was that being a non-pathogen was primitive, and that pathogenesis, the ability to cause disease, evolved out of that. But these fungi seem to be even more advanced. They have, from the evidence, the genetic evidence suggests that they were once saprophytes, became parasites, and then reverted back to subsisting on the surface as non-parasites.
Yeah, this is one of the things I love about the Sooty, Blotch, and Flyspeck story. Evolutionarily, it's just one more indication that things don't happen in the straight line that we might think. There's an awful lot of time out there in evolutionary biology, billions and billions of years, and these things don't have television, they don't have streaming, so they have a lot of time to devote to adapting properly to their environment. And what we're looking at now are the survivors, the ones that have made it through those periods. And why? This is a big question when you think about Sooty, Blotch. Why would they give up their cushy day job of penetrating? Their ancestors were, penetrating and essentially going into the candy store and eating everything they wanted. Why would they give up that great lifestyle and live on the surface, where there's nothing to eat and they're being bombarded and, broiled in the sun and, dried out? And what's the reason for that? And that's a question that's intriguing.
I had a friend from grad school who built a house next to a graveyard, and when I asked him why he had done that, he said because the neighbors were quiet. And I think maybe the Sooty, Blotch fungi have made that same key discovery. Are they simply avoiding competition? Maybe no one else wants to live in that neighborhood.
Yeah, there are fewer neighbors, right? I mean, where you live might not be the greatest, but you don't have a lot of competition for that space. And competition and fighting it out with other organisms, even microorganisms, takes energy. So they've adapted to this low energy environment, perhaps in part to avoid the headaches and the heartaches of they don't have hearts, but the headaches of they don't have heads either. The problems associated with competition. That may not be the whole story, though. There's another theory out there. It's always hard to prove these things because one can't go back into tens of millions of years of evolutionary past and verify. But the other theory is that it actually may be evolutionarily an advantage for these fungi to live on the surface, sort of detached biochemically from their own plant hosts, because they're generalists. They can live on hundreds of different kinds of plant hosts. That's kind of like spreading your bets. If you are able to colonize lots of different kinds of hosts, suppose you enter a period where the environment is changing quickly, which we seem to be in right now, some of those host plants will probably go extinct. But if you have hundreds of host plants, you're probably okay, because your host plant, even if a couple of them or some of them go extinct, you'll have others that you still can colonize. So it may be a rather good strategy, this simplification, very, very broad host range, maybe a good long-term strategy to survive periods when the environment is changing rapidly. They're slow-moving, modest, inconspicuous organisms that have lasted a long time and may last millions of years yet.
For more information about the International Year of Plant Health, visit us at plantopiapodcast.org. Thanks for listening. Our show is produced by John Bryce. Thanks also to Mark Gleason, Jim Bradeen, Laura Isles, and Roshni Karate. I'm your host, David Gadori, and you've been listening to Plantopia.